Hi, everybody. I am sitting here with Dan Hummel, who is joining an elite group of repeat conversation partners on my channel. You're one of two so far. You and Andy Root, the only two. Yeah, my second interview, actually, as we're recording this, my second interview with Andy hasn't been published yet. So,
Mhm.
so yeah, that is a much sought after status, I'm sure, on the internet. uh,
It's an honor for sure. Yeah.
well, it's great to have you back, Dan. So just so the whoever's watching this gets a little bit of context for this conversation, we're going to talk about Christian Zionism, which is an area of expertise in Dan's research. And the build up to this conversation was with, as we record this, it's the week before Thanksgiving in 2023. There's a lot of just tragedy unfolding in Israel, Palestine, and that region of the world right now, as I'm sure everyone who's watching this knows. And so, what precipitated me reaching back out to Dan, we had talked previously about your work on dispensationalism and that history in the US. And it just one morning, as many people are right now, I've been trying to do a deep dive myself and trying to wrap my mind around the history of that region of the world. And also related to that, the role of different religious thoughts and ideologies and philosophies and all of that stuff. And so one morning I'm listening to a podcast and it just dawns on me, I have a connection to someone who's an expert in Christian Zionism and that history and who's done a lot of historical work there. So why don't I email him and see if he wants to come back on YouTube? And so here we are. And so I emailed, and Dan was gracious enough to write me back right away and say that sounds like a lot of fun to talk through that topic. So let's do it. So that's how this conversation came together. So to be fair, I have not read your book is called Covenant Brothers. Is that right? On
That's
this
right.
subject. Yeah, I have not
Yeah.
read that book. It's on my list. It's on my short list now. I have read your work on dispensationalism. So while I have not read your book, I still have done some reading around the subject. I read a book you endorsed by Donald Lewis called A Short History of Christian Zionism, which I would definitely recommend. And the agenda for this conversation is just to kind of talk through it. Just talk through the. We're not going to plumb the depths of the history and the complications therein, but I especially would love to start with kind of a zoomed out look at the subject of Christian Zionism. And then I'd really like to try to get to the role of American evangelical kind of practice and religion as it connects to Zionism. So that's kind of my hope for our conversation, but we'll go wherever the conversation takes us. So yeah, so thanks again for jumping back
Yeah.
on, for doing this. I think this is I do really I think that for the listeners of my channel, I do think this is going to resonate with them. Just the ability to have kind of a historically informed
Mm.
conversation through this. I think it's going to be really helpful. I know that the research I've been doing has been already extremely helpful for me over the past month. So that all being said, that's my long preamble. But I would love to just give you a probably unfairly broad question to start, which is how would you even attempt a definition of Christian Zionism?
Yeah. Well, I'm really happy to be with you. And what I like about this conversation is we're not probably going to get as much to sort of debating
Yeah.
the truth or falsity of certain theological claims. I think that there's a role for that. I think we've seen a lot of that happening in the last month and before.
Yeah.
But there's also like a needed background
Yes.
context of why do certain people even believe in this stuff,
Yes.
and what would motivate people to. I always try to. I study this. I wrote a book called Covenant Brothers on Christian Zionism, and one thing that hit me over and over again, that was my dissertation turned into a
Mm,
book, and I remember thinking, just trying to get out of my own Christian context and everything, like, why do people on one half of the globe care about this little plot of land on the other side of the globe
right.
so much? And that's not to cheapen the care, but it's just to say, like, this is an interesting phenomenon, particularly
Mhm.
Christians who care a lot about Israel Palestine,
Right.
that is not necessarily, I mean, it's not a given. There's all other parts of the globe that people don't polarize over, and yet this is one that has consistently been at the center of conversation for thousands of years,
Yeah.
you could say. So anyway, that's all to say, I like these types of conversations. They let us sort of pull back and just get a sort of grounding for what should happen at some point, which is some true sort of sifting and winnowing of truth
That's
for
good.
what is true. In terms of a definition, I mean,
That's
you're
really
gonna
helpful.
yeah, you're gonna run through if you got, what's the joke about Baptists? Like if you have 5 scholars of Christian Zionism, you'll get 6 definitions or something like that of Christian Zionism. I like to try to be as simple as possible. So I try to zero in on arguments or movements for the support of a Jewish homeland in Palestine or the historic homeland, Holy Land, that are rooted in Christian theological claims and Christian interpretations of the Bible. And so that tries to narrow out some other arguments that would be Zionist arguments or pro-Zionist arguments that would come from a Jewish tradition. And of course, there's a lot of those, would come from an entirely non-religious tradition or entirely non-religious, maybe not entirely, it's not the right word, but is fronting non-religious arguments about humanitarianism, about geopolitics, about, sort of nationalist claims to the land. I mean, these things, of course, touch on religion to some extent, but can also be talked about separately from that and often have a more modern context within which to understand them. So, the idea of nationalism, which is at the core of the current Israel-Palestine conflict. Nationalism, as most historians think about it, is a pretty recent phenomenon of the last 200 or 300 years. And so you can't sort of project that that cause or that argument back to the Middle Ages or earlier when you do still have, things to talk about. So anyway, I try to narrow in on the claims that Christians are making that are rooted in their tradition or in their interpretation of the Bible that get them to in some way support Israel, the modern state of Israel, or before there was a modern state of Israel, the concept of a modern state.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And that's one of my, so I'm going to be, as a sounding board, I'm going to be stepping into someone who's been drinking from a fire hose in terms of learning the past month. So I'm going to be kind of, I think, filtering and rephrasing some things. Maybe I'll be a stand-in for the quote unquote normal person who's just learning all this all the stuff right now. And one of the big things I've been learning about is the wide diversity of Zionisms that exist. And what I mean by that is the different historical roots of different ideas, but also the different formulations of arguments. So like you just alluded to the humanitarian argument, you alluded to, there can be completely secular in the sense of not referring to any sort of sacred tradition or religious text arguments for a safe nation known as Israel to exist. There are all kinds of arguments for that are rooted in all kinds of different histories and arguments and reasons. And that just has been mind-blowing for me to realize just how many different arguments there are. And so what I hear you zeroing in on is like the Christian Zionism kind of subset of all those arguments is an argument that is explicitly Christian theologically and biblically, which does set itself apart from all those other arguments. Although they all overlap in different ways, as you say. There's Venn diagrams of all these things where like certain Christian Zionist arguments will adopt arguments from Jewish nationalist arguments or humanitarian globalist argument. There's lots of different, nothing is a neat and tidy category, but that's a really helpful way to start to get at what is the specific thing we're talking about, which does bring in that Christian theological angle. So
I would say most Christian Zionists, like if you just ran into a very pro-Israel evangelical Christian today and you got them to list, if they could, all the reasons why they're pro-Israel, you'd see different arguments. They're not all going to be religious arguments as such. They're going to talk about shared cultural values, maybe, or they maybe talk about Israel as a democracy, and that's one reason why we should support them. All that kind of stuff. So even someone we'd categorize as a Christian Zionist in sort of a description doesn't mean that is the sole way that they're thinking about this issue. But it does mean they're probably adding on arguments that a Jewish person or a non-religious person would not invoke, and those would be ones that are rooted in specific Christian theology or Christian understanding. So this is something I talked to a good number of reporters, and they always want to know, like, why do evangelicals support Israel? And I want to get to the theological reasons why that are distinctive, but the first thing I always want to say is, well, they support Israel because a lot of Americans support Israel for these reasons that are not necessarily rooted in their evangelicalism or their Christianity. And I think it does a disservice if we just describe them based on these peculiar theological beliefs and don't acknowledge that they are also swayed by
Right.
these other arguments that you can definitely push back on those arguments and say those aren't good arguments, but they're not arguments that are unique to Christians
That's good.
to support Israel.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So maybe we'll name some of those as we go. Some of the arguments that you're talking about, I'm sure that we'll bump into them as we kind of talk through the history. But I do really, since your expertise is more of the history, I'd like to dig into that a little bit. So when would you say? And I want to also, maybe as it comes up, I want to comment on the nationalism piece of that, because that's been also a big thing I've been learning about, is the ways that historic kind of the emergence of the modern nationalistic idea is so much embroiled in all this. So maybe that would be something we can comment on too. But when would you? What are some potential dates or timelines for the beginnings of Christian Zionism? And I know that's really broad, but like, what are some? Where maybe would you start to pinpoint some historical events and antecedents that lead to what we know as Christian Zionism?
Yeah, and I think one other term to just add in here, which is a related term, is this idea of restorationism being a certain Christian expectation. And that's the idea that Christians who expect some type of restoration of ancient Israel, of biblical Israel, to happen in the future. So at some point from whoever we're talking about, that they anticipate in the future from there that Jews will regather in their ancient homeland and will be restored in some sense to a kingdom status. That's a tradition that that goes back in a strong way, at least to the Reformation. So we're talking, 500 years of history there. Going before that, you don't see a lot of nearly as much restorationism. You see that as sort of a minor note in some traditions. And this is where there's all these complicated sort of layered conversations to have. But one conversation that's often quickly conscripted into the restoration conversation is sort of an eschatology conversation. Like, how does that restoration fit into an end time scenario? And that's where we can be potentially misled if we conflate those things. And so, a key part of modern day Christian Zionism is that it is largely held to by people who we call premillennialists, people who are expecting Jesus to come back soon and establish the kingdom, the millennial kingdom, and that Israel has some role to play in that kingdom. So the premillennialism is a tradition that goes back, as we call it now, all the way back to the church fathers, and it's debated among early Christians if this is the right view, or if there are other views that are better. But most of those early church fathers were not restorationists. They did not have a sense that there was a distinct destiny for Jewish people aside from converting and joining the Christian church.
Right.
So restorationism is really key to Christian Zionism, because most Christian virtually all of them are singling out Israel as a very special nation, and the people who constitute Israel are the ethnic Jewish people, the people who have a descent from Abraham, like a sort of a physical descent from Abraham. So the restorationism story goes back to the Reformation era. It's particularly powerful in the Puritan era, the Puritan movement, which of course has a big role to play in American history. But Puritans on the question of eschatology are all over the board. So there are a few premillennialist Puritans, and that makes them look a lot more like modern day Christian Zionists. But there are other Puritans who are postmillennialists, people like Jonathan Edwards, actually, who held together a Jewish restorationist expectation, but also thought that he thought that America was actually ushering in the kingdom of God in the present day. So that's all to say that we want to separate out what it seems really close today, which is eschatology and Christian Zionism, and say that actually historically those have been separate though overlapping conversations. And so for the first so from the Reformation to about the 19th century, the most dominant restorationist voices, the ones that were saying Jews are going to regather, we should expect some type of national entity to emerge from that, came out of Puritan or Reformed traditions.
And specifically, if I'm remembering right, the Calvinist thread of Reformed tradition is really what drove this.
That's right. And that was partly their reading of the Bible. It was also partly an interesting, and Donald Lewis, his book gets into this a lot, but there's also this interesting way that, like, the Puritans saw themselves sort of as an Israel, as a,
Mm,
I mean, they would use that language pretty regularly, and they regularly quote the Old Testament as God's talking to Israel, and take it on
about
as
them.
God talking to themselves. And so they had a fascination with Jews and with Judaism that is more than other Christian traditions had at the time, which
Mm,
made them more interested in this idea that somehow the Jews still had some type of destiny to play. If you go back to Augustine and the bigger tradition before the Reformation, the role of the Jews was really low, negative, and
mm,
we actually trace sort of very long-standing anti-Jewish
right.
polemics to this period. So someone like Augustine saw the Jews condemned to wander as part of their fate because they rejected Jesus as
The
their
rejection of
Messiah.
Christ. Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
And this was a teaching that was picked up by the Catholic Church and was regularly announced
Yeah.
every Easter. This would be sort of pointed to that Jews
Wow.
this was where the trope of the wandering Jew came from, that
Right.
the Jew would never sort of have roots. And this was the source of a lot of anti-Jewish and then later anti-Semitic
Right.
thinking as well. And so that for much of church history, that is a big part of the legacy of the way Christians think about Jews and Judaism, and the idea that there would be a future for the Jewish people in some type of prophetic sense or some type of national sense seemed entirely unrealistic or
Mm,
against even what the Bible's lessons were, which is when you reject Jesus, you get punished or cursed. So the reformers came in, and one thing the Reformation did is it allowed a lot more people to start interpreting the Bible in their
mm.
vernacular languages. It also propelled a reintroduction to the original biblical languages, which included Biblical Hebrew.
Hebrew. Yeah.
And so these things caused, just like the idea that the Puritans had that they were like Israel, these things caused increased interest in Judaism, in Jewish history, and in ancient Israel. And
Mm,
so for a subset of those people, they started interpreting prophetic parts of the Bible, and just sort of other parts of the Bible as indicating that there would be a restoration of the Jewish
mm,
people. So up till
mm.
the 19th century, it's a pretty diffuse group of people. It's pretty fringe. I mean, there's not like a big mass movement of people saying, let's get the Jews back to
Mhm.
Palestine or something like that. There is an increase in Jewish evangelism, which is part of the contradictory story here, which is some of the people that were most interested in the restoration idea were also the ones that were most interested in converting
Trying to
Jews to
convert Jews to
Christianity,
Christianity. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
today we would say, particularly taking the Jewish perspective, is an entirely non-starter, right? Like
Right. Right.
converting actually means you're no longer Jewish to most
Right.
Jews. But that's just to show that it was much different long ago, and that
Hmm.
these were tied together. And so
Hmm.
many of the early Jewish mission societies were also restorationist in orientation, but their big goal was to actually convert Jews to Christianity, and then they believed that would sort of usher in a process that would allow Jews, sort of redeem Jews in their view, to establish their homeland again in Palestine. So
Hmm.
it's a very diffuse and messy story for most of the history, and I think that's something just to get across, is that the way we talk about it now is as if there's sort of this concerted block of Christians who have this very a fixed view on
Right.
what Israel means, is basically a 100-year story. That
Wow.
we could go back maybe a few decades more, 120-year story, something like that. But it is really not something, and frankly, that's as old as Zionism is as well. So the modern Zionist movement of Theodor Herzl and political Zionism, all that kind of stuff.
Late
That's
1800s, right?
Yeah, that's 1880s,
Yeah.
1890s is when that's emerging. So,
Hmm.
a lot of what we talk about now and take for granted really goes back to that period and not much before that.
Wow. Yeah. So just a couple points I'm drawing out of that. The historical recency of what we've come to view as this kind of simple understanding of Christian Zionism, but also the really the massive turn in the Reformation that was propelled by one particular strand of the Reformation and then picked up by the Puritans, who were trying to purify the Anglican Church towards a more of a Calvinistic expression. If I'm, I always cringe a little bit when I'm making these historical generalities, but I think that's a fair thing to say. Is like, and then part of this restorationist view, just to recapitulate kind of what you said, the restorationist view is would it be fair to say it's a broader view than what we know as Christian Zionism right now? Like it maybe could hold more of a diversity of views on the role of the Jewish people in history, or did it really just become You know what I mean? Is it a
Yeah.
broader umbrella that holds Christian Zionism under it, or did it really just go away and then become Christian Zionism?
Yeah, restorationism. I think the important thing is it's found in a diversity of traditions,
Mm,
in a way that today we associate Christian Zionism with a pretty distinct
I see.
evangelical
Yeah,
subculture. And it started as
that's helpful.
a much more esoteric fringe. The people who bought into it tended to be pretty eccentric. I mean, at least the ones we have, a lot of writings from,
Yeah.
and maybe that's part of it too. But it was broad in some sense, but it was often, even in like Victorian Britain, so 19th century.
Mm,
I mean, the sort of restorationist / Christian Zionist class tended to be middle or upper middle class reformer types, from a very small strata of
mm,
society, compared to some type of what we see today in the U.S., which is a very broad mass interest in this movement.
right.
So that's a 20th century story, 20th century story of the way that this becomes sort of a major part of Christian culture, whereas it used to be sort of a subculture or a substream of theological history or something
Mm,
like that. It's now something that has been organized and popularized in a way that is pretty broad. And you're
mm,
for many evangelicals, you have family members who are really invested in this issue or something like that. I don't think that's how it was even 150 years ago. I
that
think
makes
it was
sense.
quite a select group of people who really cared about this issue.
That makes sense. Okay. Man, so I love Reformation era history, and we could easily gobble up all our time just sitting on that. That's probably what I would do if I just had the choice. But I want to jump into the late 1800s. So what happened in the late 1800s that sparked something new in this whole movement?
Well, an important thing that happened a few decades before was the introduction of dispensational premillennialism, as we call it. That's
Hmm.
a particular theology that had at the center of it this idea that God's covenants with the Jewish people that were forged in the books of Genesis and on were still in effect. And
Hmm.
so, unlike that wandering Jew tradition, that God was still
Mm,
looking to work through the Jewish people to redeem the world. And that is that's quite a distinctive belief at the time for dispensationalism, which originally was founded in the exclusive brethren movement. At least the original ideas were sort of brought together in that movement, and then it became popularized in the U.S. over the course of the 1840s through the 1880s. To the point that by the 1880s there was a pretty big chunk of American evangelical revivalism and institutions that were bought into this view. And so this view had this idea that God had not rejected the Jewish people. That's a phrase that comes out of that
mm,
tradition. And so that God's covenants were still active. And so then this commitment informed the way they read prophecy,
mm,
which was that prophecy that actually referenced Israel had yet to be fulfilled. And so when there's a land promise, or there's a promise of regathering the Jewish people in their ancient homeland in Jeremiah or Ezekiel or other parts of the Bible, that these were things that were to happen still in the future. And
mm,
so dispensationalists, at least a subset of them, become really interested in Zionism and in this sort of proto-Zionism in the 1870s, 1880s, that seems to be like an authentic Jewish movement to do the very thing that they see prophecy saying will happen.
yeah.
And so there's a few key players. The one American that's really interesting and important is a guy named William Blackstone, who is associated with Dwight Moody. He's at the
Hmm.
sort of core of the revivalist tradition in America. And Blackstone is a dispensationalist who is really concerned. He's also someone committed to Jewish missions, so he's combining that
Mm,
conversion interest with the restorationist interest. But he's really interested in trying to help Jews all around the globe settle back in what he assumes is their homeland, Palestine. And he's particularly concerned about Russian Jews. And this is a period when Russian Jews are being oppressed,
the
persecuted pretty,
pogroms
yeah, the
and yeah,
pogroms by the czars,
right.
and it's really awful. And so in 1891 he gets together what's called the Blackstone Memorial, but it's a public statement that actually does not talk about prophecy.
Mm,
It talks more about the humanitarian concern, but also has this argument that God gave this land to the Jewish people, and so it is theirs by right. So that's a sort of Christian argument or a
mhm,
biblical argument for this. And he gets an amazing array of people to sign this document in 1891, including senators, congresspeople, a future president, members of the Supreme Court,
Wow.
and then J.P. Morgan signed it. John Rockefeller signed it. Like major businessmen signed it. And so this goes to show you that this sentiment about restorationism was actually quite mainstream
Yeah.
for Americans at the time. Now, Blackstone had particular prophetic beliefs that came out of his dispensationalist commitments that were not shared by J.P. Morgan and others. So he was strategic in what he marshaled forward in his letter. But he presented that letter to Benjamin Harrison, who was the president at the time, one of our many forgotten late 19th century presidents. And it didn't really go anywhere, in part because what does the U.S. have to say about a territory that was at that point governed by the Ottoman Empire? Like, there's nothing the U.S.
I was gonna
can
say
do
this is pre-World War I. There's no
But it said something, at least on the sort of political front. And then it was actually reintroduced during World War I as Woodrow Wilson was negotiating all the sort of post-World War I land issues, including what would ultimately happen, which is that Britain would take up control over this part of the Middle East. And so not the Balfour Declaration, that's the British one. The Blackstone Memorial was reintroduced again at that time. And so historians point to it as like a sign that something is afoot. And then Blackstone is key in the early 20th century in starting up some of the more popular Christian Zionist activity that we now associate with Christian Zionism. One of the key things he did is he published a book called Jesus is Coming, which was all about the second coming, but it had in it a lot on Zionism and a lot on, at that time, the exciting news of the waves of Jewish immigrants coming to Palestine. And so if you were a reader of that, you would sort of see the eschatology and the Zionism just right there together in the book. And you would come away thinking, okay, these things are really tightly wedded together, and this is an authentic biblical presentation of what Christians should think. And so he's really important in that sense as prefiguring a lot of later people who really wed these things together, and also are very interested in organizing politically to get something done on the ground. So there's something about these ideas that's interesting. People can always hold ideas. To me, it's really interesting when they actually decide to organize around these ideas and try to affect the world. And that's what you see with Blackstone, is the beginning of that process in American history of Christians organizing to try to actually affect Zionism or affect the outcomes on the ground in Palestine.
And was the goal, so date this again, is this pre-World War, is this pre-Balfour Declaration at this point, his book?
Yeah, Jesus is Coming is from the late 19th century as well.
Oh,
I believe it's right around I think it's 1888 is when he publishes that book. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I'm just trying to timestamp that. So would the argument at that point have been establishing a like nation state with recognized boundaries legally? You know what I mean? Would that have been the argument, or was the argument was that explicit?
Yeah. So we're already in the era of nationalism at this point. So these are the exact same years that Theodor Herzl, who becomes the sort of father of political Zionism, is talking about the need for a Jewish autonomous state. Herzl's looking at anti-Semitism in Western Europe. He's in France, and he's saying the same basic thing, which is, it's going to become intolerable for Jews to live in Europe at some point soon. So he's calling for that. At the same time, Blackstone's assuming that's what's going to happen. Now, again, during this whole time, the Ottoman Empire is actually in control of this land. What many Westerners don't have a lot of respect for that. I mean, there's Orientalism and other things going on. But so there isn't actually an ability to affect, obviously, the Ottoman Empire's policy on these things until World War I and the British come in. But there's still an interest, even if it's misguided, by people like Blackstone to try to organize U.S. energies on this issue.
And Blackstone was driven, at least in part, by this prophetic kind of zeal so the premillennialist notion of like, this is going to happen before the millennial reign of Christ. And so there's something interesting happening around this time about this idea that like almost that we can kind of prepare the ground for this eschatological breakthrough. And that seems to be, I know it's always, you can't really get into the psychology of someone like a historical figure like Blackstone, but that does seem to be, it's playing some part, at least it seems. And it's just, that's kind of lining up with these other figures like Herzl at the same time. That's almost just the constellations or the stars are kind of aligning, so to speak, to push these things forward. Wow. Well, let's talk about the Balfour Declaration. That seems like maybe the next kind of natural historical thing to unpack. So what's happening around that, especially as it relates to evangelical dispensationalism, religion, American practice? I don't know unpack that for us.
And it's interesting because obviously the Balfour Declaration is not American. This is a British
Right.
declaration issued by the British government. And dispensationalism is not a major influence in
Mm.
the British government, to say the least.
Sure.
So what's actually happening there is the longer history of Restorationism had taken root in a particular class of British evangelicalism that many of the leaders of World War One for Britain grew up in a just assumed restorationist culture.
Mm.
So that's
Wow.
one of the influences, and it wasn't this dispensationalist particular way. It was the broader sense of appreciation of the history of Israel, and then this assumption that the Bible predicted or prophesied in
Yeah.
some vague way that the Jews would return to their homeland in the future. So that's part of it. The other part, which is often the part that most of us talk about, is the more strategic, geostrategic reason that the Balfour Declaration was issued.
To
Um,
destabilize the Ottoman
I mean,
power, essentially, or is there more going on there? Probably.
that's one. Another is to shore up British Jewish support for the war, to give them
Oh,
something to.
I see.
And there was lobbying by Zionists to the British government saying, "Hey, this would be a really good thing to do right now to make sure." And this is part of the story of World War One is that the war took a lot longer and was a lot more destructive to the European powers than they initially thought.
Right.
And so there were all types of domestic politics issues in Germany and Britain and France, in the U.S., not less in the U.S. because it was so shortly involved in the war, but in the Ottoman
Hmm.
Empire and elsewhere. That meant that domestic constituents often got pretty big concessions from their governments as the
Hmm.
war ground on and became more and more costly. And so this was
Wow.
one of the efforts that the British government used, because Jews were prominent in British society.
Hmm.
Some of them were key business leaders, some of them were key political leaders. And so this was one of the ways that the British government tried to shore up that support.
Wow.
And so then when we get to the afterward, the aftermath of World War One, this is where we in many ways we're still living with the decisions that were made after
Yeah.
World War One. A
Yeah.
lot of the national lines on our map are still from 1920, 1925,
Hmm.
times like that. And certainly the Middle East has changed a lot since then, but in some fundamental ways, it really started on this trajectory that we still see today at this period. And so Britain and France have a secret agreement during the war that then turns into a public agreement where they're going to basically split up most of the what we call the Middle East now between them,
Hmm.
as they have designs on the Ottoman Empire collapses, and so there's a lot of opportunity for the victors in World War One to sort of move in, become colonial powers there. They create what's called the mandate system, and so this is a system that is maybe colonialism light. It's colonialism, but it's with a trajectory toward autonomy.
Hmm.
And so this is where the Mandate of Palestine comes from. So this is
Wow.
a part of the post World War One arrangement, and it now includes what is now Jordan and Israel and the disputed territories. And actually a little more than that. But this was the Mandate of Palestine, and this was administered by the British with, on paper, the idea that over time this would become an autonomous nation state,
Hmm.
but in practice was a British colony for the most
Hmm.
part, at least for the first few years. And then nationalism rears its ugly head again, I guess you could say, and both Jewish Zionists who continue to migrate to the area and the Arab population that's there and the surrounding Arab population, both are becoming more and more nationalistic.
Hmm.
And the really hard thing about modern nationalism is it's the claim that a people deserve an exclusive territorial sovereignty over
Hmm.
an area. And that we take that for granted for most nations, except for the ones where there's a dispute over,
Yeah.
and frankly, there were disputes over a lot of them that ended in one side entirely losing. So we even forget about that
Right.
side. But
Right.
but
So
in
there's
this
not an
case,
ongoing contestation or conflict
right.
because of
And
yeah. Yeah.
frankly, you can think about the history of Native Americans and the
Right.
U.S. Like there was such a destruction there
Yeah.
that that there wasn't really a dispute at some
Right.
point. I mean, the U.S. had such commanding control.
Right.
But in the Mandate of Palestine, the British had to manage a surging Jewish Zionist contingent and an organizing Arab nationalist contingent as well. And
Hmm.
so
Wow.
The mandate period is a period of stewing and increasing intensity between these two sides, and then all types of outside powers trying to navigate that, trying to exploit it, trying to support one side or the other. And in many ways, the conflicts that we're seeing today, I mean, they go back even further than that, of course, but a lot of it is actually quite modern and around these political lines that were, fashioned in a way after World War I. And so, by the time we get to the 1940s, we have a large, hundreds and hundreds of thousands large Jewish population in the mandate, and we have a large, hundreds and hundreds of thousands strong Arab population, which, because it's the mandate of Palestine, is increasingly taking on this identity of being Palestinian.
Right.
Like there's a distinct Arab group that's in this region, and they're both claiming a lot of this territory for themselves. And that gets us to sort of the modern Arab-Israeli conflict in a lot of ways, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
One thing I wanted to know was that Lewis's book reminded me of was just, and this is more on the American Christian evangelical side of things, like just how much World War I underlined and affirmed a lot of the prophetic dispensationalistic predictions of the shifting world order and the role of Russia and all that stuff. I was just reminded in a profound way reading his book about like, oh yeah, the World War I really gave a huge boost to a lot of this explicit biblical prophetic interpretation kind of framework. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to recap about that, because we're in that time period now, post World War I, leading up to World War II. Like it seems like the dispensationalists had a lot of I don't know, wind in the sails, so to speak, at that time. Is that correct?
And yes, certainly from their perspective, yeah. So you can think about as Christian Zionism, one of the functions it plays within the evangelical world for people who believe in it is that it's part of the validation, empirical validation of their reading of the Bible. So if they can point to things happening in the world and saying, hey, my reading of the Bible says this would happen, that's a really strong argument that you actually are reading the Bible correctly. And so some key events like General Allenby, the British general, conquering Jerusalem in 1917 was seen as like a prophetic. There's a prophecy in Luke about the times of the Gentiles and Jerusalem, and this seemed like, oh, this might be the fulfillment of that prophecy. 1948 is a huge one because that's when Israel declares its statehood, and this seems to be a fulfillment of all these prophecies about the Jews regathering and sort of regaining. And then the third event is 1967, where Israel expands its control to include many biblical areas, including the old city of Jerusalem. So the city in the Bible, is much smaller than modern day Jerusalem. And up until 1967, that was Jordanian territory. That was part of Jordan's part of Jerusalem. With the 67 war, Israel takes over that. Israel takes over many areas in the West Bank that are biblical, that have biblical significance. And if you go today to do like a Holy Land tour in Israel, a lot of your tour is actually going to be in post 1967 Israel territory. It's not going to be in what Israel controlled before 1967.
In 48. Wow, I didn't know that.
And so that's seen as a whole nother prophetic fulfillment. So by 1967 or 68, evangelical Christians who come out of this dispensationalist tradition think that like they've had multiple validations over and over again. And so they're looking for the next thing, or at least some of them are, which would be the rebuilding of the temple. They think that's sort of the next thing that has to happen on the prophetic timeline, which is rebuilding a literal sacrificial temple, sort of where the Dome of the Rock is now, which is considered the historic site of the Jewish temple. And that to them is sort of the next step. But they look for that in part because they see their own interpretations. They've had a string of right calls on the interpretation of prophecy that are these empirical proofs. And so even in the last month, when there have been a number of megachurch pastors and others who've streamed their sermons talking about the prophetic significance of the Israel-Hamas war and all that kind of stuff. I mean, some of that is this fascination with prophecy and the Middle East. Parts of it are also apologetical, you could say. It's sort of reinforcing to the community, we've got the right reading here.
I see.
Like this is validating. Maybe we didn't predict this precise exact unveiling of events, but it's pretty close, at least compared to other Christian traditions. So that's a really key role that Christian Zionism plays throughout the evangelical church, you could say, ever since this period, is that it seems to be validating a what we might call a plain reading or a literalist reading of the Bible. And so if you come out of that tradition, you point to these things and say, well, these obviously are really important to me because they're the outside the Bible proof that we have the right reading of the text.
Wow. So, and there's also a almost modernist evidentiary kind of approach to looking at geopolitical events, and shoring up your beliefs through that. Wow, man, there's a lot there's a lot to potential impact there. And so move through 67, and 67, it does seem like by all accounts it's almost appears a miraculous turn in world history. Like, if I'm remembering right, Israel was on the defensive in that conflict, although I'm sure that could be could be argued. But and then the seizure of all this land was just like, I guess, really unexpected before it happened. Is that true? Is that
yes?
Accurate?
In May, so the war happened in June of 1967. It's called the 6-Day War sometimes because it only lasted 6 days. But in May of 1967, it was very dark days for American Jews, for Israeli Jews, and for many Christians. I mean, many were expecting you could call it like they called it like a second Holocaust. Like the way it was looking was that Egypt, Syria, Jordan, all the surrounding Arab states were amassing all of their forces and clearly getting ready to do some type of military action. So in that sense, Israel was on the defensive, but on the morning of the beginning of the war, they actually fired the first shot. They surprise attacked. They had, in international legal language, they had claimed to have a casus belli, like Egypt had done enough provocative things to have a justification for war.
I see.
But because Israel surprise attacked, they basically destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force the first morning and had unfettered access to the air. And then there was just a stunning. It's more stunning sometimes in retrospect than in the case. Like, people knew that Israel's military was pretty good. It performed well in previous. I guess no one was aware of how underwhelming the Arab armies would be. I think that would be the best way to say it. And so within those 6 days, Israel basically took control of territory that made them 3 times as large as when they started the war. And this included it included the Sinai Peninsula, included what we now call the West Bank. It included the Golan Heights, the rest of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and the old city. And so over the years, Israel has given back portions of those so Egypt now controls the Sinai Peninsula, for example. That came out of the Camp David Accords in the 1970s. And these other areas, though, the West Bank and others, Israel has occupied since 1967. And then there's been debates within Israel about what the fate of those territories should be. Should they be part of a land for peace deal sometime in the future? That's been more the liberal Zionist side, that the goal here is peace. And so the land is a really key bargaining chip there. The more right-wing Israelis, and this would include many Christian Zionists as well, see the West Bank in particular as biblical land that belongs to the Jewish people. And so many times they will not even refer to it as the West Bank. They'll say it's Judea and Samaria because those are biblical references to that land. And so for many people, particularly on the right, that these territories should never leave Israeli control. That this is where the settler movement comes in, and
I was going to ask
people
about that. Yeah,
taking this on themselves, basically, to say we're going to settle that area to make sure it can never go back in a peace agreement to the Palestinians. And that's where it's an interesting mix of nationalist and religious arguments, because there's definitely nationalistic reasons why you would expand your territory and all that kind of stuff, but it's often framed within religious arguments about covenant, about prophecy, on both the Jewish and the Christian side. Wow.
Well, man, I knew this was going to happen. We don't have time to recount everything else because there's still a good 40, 50 years from that to now, to what happened, especially on October 7th and what we're seeing unfold now. We don't have time to unpack all of that. So I guess, so your book on dispensationalism covers a lot of how dispensationalism moved through the 70s and 80s and into the things like the moral majority movement and all that stuff in the American scene. But I guess what would you see? One of my closing questions would be, what would you see as post 67? What are some of the key historical hinge points that get us to today, if you had to identify a couple?
Yeah, I'm particularly thinking about Christian Zionism.
Yes.
So what we call the modern Christian Zionist movement, when we look at a group like Christians United for Israel, if you look them
Hmm.
up, they're a lobby group. They claim to have 10 million members, mostly evangelical Christians. Their history can go back to the Reformation. I mean, you can tell that version of the story, and it's
Right.
in this tradition of Restorationism. In terms of the organized history, it really is a post 1967 story, and it's about
Hmm.
the coming together in a real sort of relational way and then ideological way between one segment of evangelical Christians in the US and the Israeli government in some ways on the other side. And this is a story that it starts with people like Billy Graham, who are very important in the 1960s and 1970s to facilitating a relationship between American evangelicals and Israeli officials.
Hmm.
But Graham comes and
He's
goes, and
praying over my shoulder right there. I just
oh
noticed
yeah,
that.
there you go.
It's a great biography of him. Incidentally, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, yes, and he's someone who is very important for a period, but um, ultimately is not nearly as invested in this issue as others are.
Hmm.
And so by the late 70s, you start seeing a new generation of leaders that are part of the Christian right, the moral majority type movement. So people like Jerry Falwell, people like
Right.
Pat Robertson, Tim LaHaye. These are
Hmm.
all people who come out of the dispensationalist tradition and are much more ideologically aligned with a right-wing vision of Israel. And by right-wing, I just mean a maximalist view of the land
Hmm.
and of what land Israel should control,
I see.
and of a skepticism of the peace process, of the idea that there
Hmm.
could be peace between Jews and Arabs. The new wave in the late 70s, 80s of evangelical leaders or fundamentalist leaders is much more aligned with Israeli leadership on this. And so
Hmm.
the 80s and 90s is when you start seeing an intermingling and an actual cooperation between evangelical Christians and Israel. But it's still quite haphazard. And if you think of like a group like the Moral Majority, that's Jerry Falwell's big political group in the 80s, the Moral Majority was really, really activated on domestic issues like prayer
Hmm.
in school and
Right.
abortion and other things.
Right.
Israel was in there, and it was always in their statements of values that they supported Israel, but it was not the key thing. And so it often was not the priority when Falwell was trying to organize politically.
Hmm.
And that was the case in the 90s as well. There's a number of, the Christian Coalition is a big organization in the 90s that's organizing largely on domestic politics as well. If you get to 2006, that's the founding of Christians United for Israel. And this is the first national single issue organization of evangelicals on this issue
Oh,
of
wow.
Christian Zionism. And
2006.
2006, and
Wow.
it's founded by John Hagee, who's a pastor down in
Hmm.
San Antonio, who was already in this world for about 20 years before that, or organizing at a local level to support Israel. And this was also the sort of the iconic story is that Benjamin Netanyahu, who at that point was out of power, but has been prime minister of Israel for a very long time,
Hmm.
actually approached Hagee and said, "Can you create an organization that'll speak with one voice for evangelicals on
Wow.
Israel?" And I don't know how true that is, by the way. That's just the
Right. Could be
way Hagee,
apocryphal.
Hagee
Yeah.
talks about.
Yeah.
But that's certainly what Christians United for Israel has become. It's
Hmm.
become the stand-in, at least in Washington D.C., for the sort of, I'm putting this in square quotes, but the evangelical perspective
I see.
on Israel. And it's one that's largely shaped by dispensational theology, that's
Right.
largely shaped by conservative geopolitical commitments, and is very skeptical and even very afraid of Islam and Islamic
Hmm.
countries like Iran and Hamas for sure
Hmm.
as an organization,
Yeah.
and has really sort of dictated a lot of the way evangelicals at least are talked about in relation to Israel. Of course, the spectrum of what evangelicals view is way broader than what Christians United for Israel presents.
Right.
But at least in American politics, they've become the stand-in, and probably the height of their power or their influence was when Donald Trump moved the embassy to, and this is a minor issue, but moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and this was a
Right.
long-standing demand of many people, but including Christian Zionists, and he credited evangelicals for why he did the move. So this was like this
Right.
sort of transparent statement by the president of the United States that he did this costly political thing because evangelicals pressured him to.
Right.
And so that's
Wow.
probably still the height of Christians United for Israel's influence. But even today, even though Biden is not a Republican, obviously he's not a Christian Zionist in the traditional sense that we use that term. And he doesn't really care that much about what Christians United for Israel thinks directly, but he always has to think about them because they are out there.
Hmm.
And there are some number of evangelicals who are pretty politically engaged, who really do think about Israel when they're voting, and might might be swayed to vote for a candidate who can promise even stronger U.S. support for
Wow.
Israel than the U.S. is offering. So that's sort of the organizational history, and we're still in that era. So Christian United for Israel has been around for almost 20 years now, and they've been more and more as time goes on. They've been the central node for Republican politics around Israel. And the one way you can see this is how many presidential hopefuls have appeared at Christians United for Israel events in the last couple of years, and it's almost all of them
Wow.
have felt the need to attend, give a speech about how much they support Israel and why they do. Some of them, if they're more conservative Christian, will actually invoke theological arguments. Mike Pence did this a lot when he was on the as vice president. He wouldn't talk about prophecy, but he would talk about God granting this land to the Jewish people, and that God has an everlasting covenant with the Jewish people.
Yeah.
So you get people like him, and then you get more or less sort of overtly evangelical people, like Nikki Haley, for example, who has
Right.
also made multiple appearances here, and she articulates a more secular
Yeah.
argument, but she's still at a Christians United for Israel event doing it, and that might be the main takeaway, is that's where the sort of situation is, at least at a national level. Under it, there are literally hundreds of organizations, smaller ones, that evangelicals contribute to and are active in, that have some angle of supporting Israel or supporting Israelis, that make up the whole sort of ecosystem of Christian Zionism today.
Wow. So helpful. So helpful. We're nearing the end here, but I know I shouldn't ask an historian to predict the future, but what do you have any thoughts about where this movement is going, especially given the events of the past month? Do you have any sense?
Just two quick things on that. One is
Yeah.
I think they've never been better organized as a movement,
Hmm.
and so I think, at least for the near term and maybe even medium term, the Christian Zionist political lobby is going to be really important to the
Yeah.
way American politics processes U.S. support for Israel or U.S.
Yeah.
relations with Israel. The other side is there's a massive generational gap in evangelical
Yes.
enthusiasm about this, and it's a subculture. So they do not speak for all evangelicals.
Sure.
Certainly not all Christians. I mean, their name would imply that they speak for all Christians on this issue.
Hmm.
And so I don't know what the longer term future of a organization like Christians United for Israel is, if they can't appeal to, at this point, under 40-year-old evangelicals. Like, you
Hmm.
can go that way for a while, but at some point that's going to catch up with you.
Hmm.
And there's going to be, and we know from polling that younger evangelicals either don't care about this issue very much, or interpret it through a more social justice lens as opposed
Right.
to a dispensationalist lens or prophecy lens.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
they're interpreting it as, at best, there's a lot of injustice all around, and
Hmm.
at worst, from the perspective of Christian Zionists, that Israel is actually the oppressor here,
Right.
and that they need to be opposed and the Palestinians need to be supported. So, and I'm not evaluating
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
truth or false of that, but I'm saying that
Describing the
is,
views that exist. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and for
Hmm.
under 40 evangelicals, whether they're white or non-white, whether they're
Hmm.
Southern Baptist or I'm trying to think of something on the other end of Southern
More
Baptist, but
mainline, maybe,
yeah,
or yeah.
mainline. Well,
Hmm.
certainly mainline, but even if
Hmm.
you're Evangelical Covenant Church, or I don't know,
I see.
something that's more, it's pretty consistent across the board that
Huh.
younger
That's
evangelicals
interesting.
have changed, and part of that is the waning influence of dispensational theology on younger generations. Part of it
Right.
is that younger evangelicals just have a different issue set. They care about
Yep.
the environment, they care about diversity, they care about social justice more than their parents did, and certainly
Discourse
more than
around
their grandparents.
colonialism is so different right
Yeah.
now. Also, World War II no longer being a living memory has to have
Yes.
I think, must have an impact.
Yes, that may be one to end on, is
Mhm.
for up until even John Hagee's generation, so the guy who founded Christian United for Israel, so much of this was, yes, it was about prophecy. Yes, it was about reading the
Right.
Bible. It was also about trying to atone for Christian
Right.
anti-Semitism or
Absolutely.
anti-Judaism.
Yeah.
And particularly for someone like Hagee, he didn't have living memory, but his dad did, of the Holocaust and
Right.
of this idea. So the Holocaust was not just something the Nazis perpetrated on the Jews. It was something that confessing Christians
Yeah.
perpetrated on the Jews.
Hmm.
Most of the soldiers in the in the Wehrmacht were, went to Lutheran church or
Right.
Catholic church on Sunday and then did what they did the rest of the week. And so for many evangelicals up until very recently, that was a very present part
Yeah.
of what they were thinking about was, we don't want to be like that.
Right.
For younger evangelicals, that's just not part of our memory.
Yep.
And so there's not that same complex of evaluating sort of the obligations to support Israel for these reasons.
Yeah.
And that's something that Israelis have spent a lot of time trying to correct. There's a lot of information campaigns and other things to try to make sure the Holocaust remains present in people's minds, but there's just this inevitable over time that's just really hard to maintain.
Yeah.
And that's also, I mean, there's a lot of complicated conversations around, does sort of remembering the Holocaust imply a very particular politics that you have with Israel? Right. And there's many people who would say, listen, I'm not trying to minimize the Holocaust or anything. That does not necessarily mean that I have to sort of give a blank check to the state of Israel to do whatever they want or whatever. Right. So that's a complicated thing too. But I think that's something you definitely see with younger evangelicals, is that ever-present sense of like a global anti-Semitic satanic force. I mean, Satan was often invoked by people as saying, anti-Semitism is satanic. That's not how younger evangelicals talk about it. And so that lowers their investment on this issue as well.
That makes sense. That's really helpful, because that's been my almost gut level intuition, is that there is this generational gap that you mentioned. So it's helpful to have some of that named. Well, it will be interesting to see how specifically this movement of Christian Zionism, it just will be interesting to see how it unfolds, especially in this very weird political moment that we're in the American scene, at least. So, well, yeah, we got to stop somewhere. So that does seem like a decent place to kind of to end things. And I just wanted to reiterate as we end, like, I think part of my goal in this conversation has been to explore the historical story of this and explore where some of these ideas come from. And I just, this issue is so radioactive and so complex. And I think it's really helpful to just underline that a really good step for people. I'm 37, so I'm in that under 40 demographic of, evangelical adjacent people you mentioned. It's just really good for us to take a step back and learn a lot of this history, because I didn't know probably 92% of what you just recounted. I did not know any of it until within the past 3 weeks. And as someone who reads a lot, I imagine, there's probably a lot of people in the same boat as me that just have so much to learn before we start ranting morally certain opinions, about what should or shouldn't happen. Just learning the history is so crucial. And that's not even getting into to the theology or the biblical interpretation, or, I mean, there's just get into conversations like, and this is where I'm starting to dip my toe. I'm reading N.T. Wright's new book on Romans, which gets, he's a very, he's a certain voice that represents a certain theological strand of like this whole conversation about supersessionism and the theological role of Israel moving forward. And all that stuff, we haven't even touched any of that. I mean, that's why this stuff is so complex and multi-layered. And so I just kind of wanted to end by just underlining that it's like, it's on one level, it's okay for it to be complex, and that actually reiterates why it's so important to just learn. And starting with the history is so helpful. So thank you for your work. You've done an amazing job in this call of like rapidly moving us through a pretty wide swath of history. I imagine you've had a lot of progress in these conversations you've been having lately. So anyways, thank you. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your work on this subject. It's really, really important. I'm still learning a lot from you. I'm learning a lot from other people who do work on this, and I'm gratefully appreciative of it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the more, this isn't always true, but the more you learn about it, the less you're going to want to rant, because you realize it's just, it's just hard to have clarity. That's not always true. I mean, there is moral clarity as well. So I don't want to say it's not, but there's definitely a style that's out there right now that is ranting without a lot of background info. And I think you want to avoid that as much as possible. Agreed.
And I wasn't going to go here. I wasn't planning to go here, but this is a good last word. For someone with a theistic worldview, which I have, I do believe in God, and I believe in God's sovereignty and God's, and bringing an eschatology to this. Like I do believe, as crazy as old fashioned or unfashionable as it is, I do believe in the ultimate setting right of all things one day. I do believe in that. And for those of us in that boat, kind of surrendering to the complications of some of these issues can actually help get us back to that place of saying, like, just come alongside the ancient prophets and say, like, come Lord, tear open the heavens and make things right. And I wasn't not planning to get into a sermon on this particular call, but I do just want to say, for those of you who are watching and you feel any of that, I want to just kind of just verbalize that, because I do think that's really important, and not to do it in a pat or a cliche or superficial way, but I do think pressing into the complexities helps us get there on a more spiritual level. So yeah, we'll end there. But yeah, thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it. I appreciate our connection, and hope to be in touch in the future.
Pleasure to be with you.